they found that there'd been a 4,000% increase in reported cybersecurity breaches for UK pension schemes. So I'm a lawyer at Burges Salmon. It's my 10th year at the firm. So just in terms of the firm, we're a full service law firm. So we've got lawyers that cover all areas. My speciality is pensions law, and I'm a senior associate in our pensions team. So Burges Salmon have got one of the largest pensions teams in the country with over 40 fee earners and 10 partners within that. So we practice pensions full time as part of a national team, and we advise around 10% of the UK's trust-based occupational pension schemes. So lots of good things happening there. Broadly speaking, we advise trustees and sponsoring employers in relation to their pension schemes, but that spans the private and public sector, large commercial master trusts and non-for-profit organisations. So that's what we do as a firm in a nutshell.
Great. And as a business, you have a particular interest around cybersecurity as well. And so what is it with pension schemes and cybersecurity, which links those two areas together?
So my particular area of focus, I advise trustees and companies on a broad range of pension issues, but my particular focus is on cybersecurity, and I'm leading our team's in-house approach to cybersecurity for pension schemes, along with one of the partners in our team, Richard Pettit. So I've got experience advising a number of clients on ongoing cyber security issues, both when an incident has occurred and in times of calm when we're preparing in case something does happen. So, sort of regularly speak and write about the topic within the pensions industry. And I'm really lucky, I should just say as well, that I come from these things from a pensions angle. But because we're a full service law firm, I get to work with colleagues in other teams in our firm. So we've got a great data protection team and a great dispute resolution team. And I work quite closely with colleagues from those teams to make sure I can feed in the relevant aspects into our advice for pension schemes when it comes to cybersecurity. But yeah, I think what you were maybe getting at is why cybersecurity is important within our pensions industry.
Yeah, indeed, yes.
Well, I should start by saying cybersecurity is an important topic in all sectors and industries, but specifically within the pensions industry, it's really come into sharper focus in the last 18 months. And I suppose the direction of travel is quite clear from statistics. RPC did some research in September last year, and they found that there'd been a 4,000% increase in reported cybersecurity breaches for UK pension schemes, which is quite staggering. So in the year 21 to 22, there were only 6 reported breaches for pension schemes to the ICO, whereas in the year after 22 to 23, there were 246 reported breaches. And there's sort of no sign, I suppose, that trend's going to stop. It's not sort of an anomaly. I think what has happened essentially is cyber criminals have really started to understand that the pensions industry is an ideal target for cybercrime, because there's so much that personal data and there's so many assets. So actually, that they're a sort of open target there for these cyber criminals who are very sophisticated and becoming increasingly professional. And I suppose that the pensions industry has known about the threat of cybersecurity for some time, and the Pensions Regulator did issue some cyber guidance for trustees back in 2018. But actually at that time, it was very much best practice guidance and what trustees should be doing. And when you've got trustee boards who I think have got so many competing sort of obligations, increasing governance obligations, and dealing with, industry-wide issues such as GMP equalisation, and of course the LDI crisis, then, so just by way of an example, there's so many competing priorities. I think really what has brought cybersecurity to the fore in pensions is that there were significant cyber incidents in the industry last year, and the most significant and public of those, which I'm sure you know about, is the Capita cyber incident, which
yes, personally,
yes. So yeah, just to sort of summarise, from their pension scheme administrator point of view, a lot of pension schemes were impacted because a lot of their customer data was exfiltrated. So, I have advised and continue to advise a number of clients in relation to that, because these things, when they do hit, there's a lot of aspects to them, and a lot to be done to make sure member data is sort of secured and dealt with in an appropriate way. So I think given that context, trustees have started to wake up, and sort of people in the pensions industry have really started to wake up to this as an important issue, and I think it needs to be more of a priority on trustees' sort of agendas and risk registers this year.
How's the regulator reacted to that increase? What steps are they taking to help pension schemes?
So I said they'd issued some guidance back in 2018 about cybersecurity, and then we sort of hadn't heard too much from them since then. And in an area like cybersecurity that's fast moving, actually that was sort of quite a long time. I mean, for many years, the regulator has had a mantra that schemes should prepare for when rather than if an incident occurs, but that has always been a should prepare rather than a must prepare. Whereas in the last 6 months, there's been 3 key pieces of guidance from the regulator that's really shifted the mantra from trustees should prepare to trustees must prepare.
Right.
So in December 2023, there was updated cyber guidance published by the regulator, which was quite interesting because it's effectively kept all the headings of the 2018 cyber guidance, but effectively actually rewrote then all the guidance under those headings.
Yeah.
But the real step change is the change in emphasis, as I've said, from this should to a must.
What do those obligations look like from a trustee's perspective? How is that step change and that language change actually impacting the trustees? And
so the obligations now, so they're coming from that guidance, but just in terms of stepping back, the guidance is effectively now the how to comply. The actual sort of key underlying obligations are coming from the updated general code that came into force on the 28th of March this year. So that general code has got a cyber controls module within it, business continuity module within it, and also aspects of risk management, and they will feed into a scheme's what we call an ESOG, effective system of governance, and an ORA, an own risk assessment. So at a higher level, it's the general code principles that set the scene for what trustees must do. And then it's this accompanying cyber guidance that sets out the how that should be done. And actually there's an express statement on the face of the guidance, which is that if you comply with the expectations, if you take the practical steps under the cybersecurity guidance, then you will meet the expectations set out in the general code when it comes to cybersecurity. So that's the sort of overarching picture. But actually, what in practical terms, what do I think it boils down to in terms of what obligations are on trustees? Well, I think the sort of minimum requirement for trustees could probably be summarised in 5 sort of steps. The first step would be to have a cybersecurity policy in place. And that would be a policy which would set out in times of calm, when there's no ongoing incident, how a scheme would manage and mitigate its cyber risk. The second is to have an incident response plan in place. So that's how you'd react if you did have a live incident. The third aspect is to think about making sure, just from a practical perspective, that you've got all the contact details you need of key stakeholders in case there is an incident, because actually in a case where there are incidents, sometimes all systems will go down, and you have to rely on old-fashioned phone calls and that sort of things, or find an alternative method of communication. So making sure you have that ahead of time is really critical. The fourth thing is having a method of capturing the steps that pension schemes have taken in relation to cybersecurity, and then that can be used as the basis of an ongoing assessment going forward, because the regulators sort of requirements under the guidance and the code are that this area is monitored at least annually. And then the fifth and final element that we'd say is sort of a minimum requirement is to make sure the trustee board has got regular training on cybersecurity.
So I guess speaking as pension schemes and at its high level is very interesting, but there's massive differences in the size of the schemes, and therefore I guess there's an element of difference in what schemes are likely to be expected to do depending on their size, and having an appropriate level or proportionate level of security in place or protection in place. Guidelines and policies, as you said, may be different between larger firms and smaller firms. Is that right?
So in terms of proportionality, it is important. It's referred to throughout the general code and even sort of in the underlying legislation. And I suppose a lot of schemes, particularly smaller schemes that will typically have smaller budgets, as you've said, they may feel like they just don't know where to start with building cyber resilience for a pension scheme, or indeed more broadly, because actually there are quite a lot of strands to it. I suppose the same obligations are there, but there there is this sensible overlay of proportionality. That being said, it's not spelt out clearly within the code or the guidance exactly what that proportionality means. But we think there are some, I've set out those 5 elements that we think need to be covered as minimum requirements. And I think from our perspective, we think, you can take some reasonably sensible and easy steps to get quite a lot of the way there in terms of building cyber resilience quite quickly. It is an area where you will always be able to do more because cyber risk is always evolving, but actually you could take some steps relatively easily to get maybe 80% of the way there, which I think is probably welcome news for smaller schemes in particular. And what we've done at Burges Salmon is developed a cybersecurity package offering for pension schemes, and that's aimed to meet the minimum requirements that trustees need to meet under the general code. And so yes, has those 5 elements. It has a template cybersecurity policy, a template incident response plan, cyber hygiene quick reference guide, which contains a few helpful reminders, but also has those important contact details that I spoke about. What we call the Cybersecurity Best Practice Framework and Assessment, and that's a snapshot of everything the scheme's doing in relation to cybersecurity, and then that document can be the basis for an ongoing assessment and looking at that, annually or as required. And then basic cybersecurity training is included within that package as well. So we offer that to clients for a fixed fee. So if there's anyone interested in that, then I'd encourage them to get in touch, and I'd be very happy to provide further information about that.
Great. And I guess if you go beyond the guidelines that might be there as a sort of minimum standard, where do the schemes go beyond that to increase their resilience to cyber attacks?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's lots you can do because cybersecurity is an evolving risk, and there's probably always more you can do. There are some things, I suppose, that I'd suggest that, so in terms of the minimum, as I've said, that I think should be reviewed at least annually, which is consistent with the regulator's expectations set out under that cybersecurity guidance. But other sort of building blocks on top of that minimum requirements that we've talked about might include data and asset mapping, so being really clear, and a lot of schemes will have done this as part of their sort of preparations for GDPR coming into force in 2018, but again, a lot of schemes might have done that initial piece around understanding where all their data flows were, but might not have updated it since GDPR came into force, which was around 6 years ago now. So there's quite often a piece to do there because you might have changed providers or added providers on. Anyone who hasn't got cyber security as a risk in their risk register should absolutely add that in. I spoke as well about GDPR, and at the time schemes put in place data protection documents, so there was normally a data protection policy and a privacy notice or a fair processing notice. So to the extent those haven't been reviewed, it'd be good to sort of dig those out, make sure they are still appropriate and are up to date, especially to reflect any sort of changes, which will include Brexit, for example. Something that clients actually really tend to like is more in-depth cybersecurity training, and that can be more traditional training, or it can be more role-play style training, which might be, sometimes what we refer to as war game training. So you'd effectively, be working through an incident. So that can be quite useful in terms of just understanding the kind of things that a trustee board would need to think about, and whether there are any gaps, and whether they need to think about how to plug those gaps going forwards. Reviewing third-party contracts as well is another area where, it isn't always considered, but you need to be asking the right questions of your third-party suppliers. What are they doing in terms of what incident response plans do they have in place, and what are they doing to protect themselves in times of calm? But also, one thing we learned, I think, from the cyber incidents that have happened in the industry last year is quite often they will be quite, at the time the incident hits in particular, they'll be quite time intensive, and quite often whether you can recover the costs of dealing with the incident will depend on what is in your contract. And a lot of contracts just will not include any provisions at all around cybersecurity. They'll have some data protection provisions, but they won't actually include data protection wording. They will include data protection wording, but they won't have included any cybersecurity wording.
Right.
So actually that can be an area to look at for existing third-party suppliers. And anytime you're appointing someone new, it's an area where I'd suggest sort of focusing in on to see what is there, if anything.
Yeah, I like the idea of the war games piece. I had met with a firm that supports companies that have been attacked. They ran through sort of the anatomy of an attack and said that by the time you know about it, everything's happened, and it could have happened quite some time ago. So actually, what you naturally would instinctively think you need to do is maybe not going to have any impact at all. And it is a little more around protecting people or trying to get data back if it's been taken, or those ransom requests, and trying to manage that situation that way, rather than saying, right, the first thing we need to do is lock the front door effectively. But it's like, well, no, it's all happened already. You're hearing about it now, but it's gone. So I think the war games thing would be great to bring that sort of thing to life to people.
And I suppose linked to that is, when you go through an exercise like that, you think, oh, who would I pick the phone up to if we had a cyber incident? Who would I pick the phone up to? And you want to sort of keep the incident team as sort of small as you can, I think, to the extent that makes sense to do. But equally, you want to have the right skills and expertise in there. And it might be that you want to know who the person is, who the right people are to call on if that happens. And so from a legal perspective, we'd say it's important to get a lawyer involved early on. And the reason for that is effectively that if you have a lawyer involved, you should be able to benefit from legal privilege. Right. So when you're having discussions around how an incident has occurred, and quite often there's speculation around, whose fault it was, etc. If you can sort of benefit from the umbrella of legal privilege, then you can have those discussions in a safe and open way, including with third parties to the extent that's appropriate, and instructing third parties even through that umbrella of privilege, which then means down the line, if you're in a situation where there was a regulatory investigation, or if it happened that actually you ended up going to court because of a particular incident, then, those discussions around, working out what has happened and who is at fault, etc., would be sort of protected under that umbrella of privilege. I should say as well that obviously, like I said at the start, I'm a pensions lawyer, and my disputes colleagues are, always on hand to talk to me about legal privilege, because it's a huge topic just in itself.
Yeah, I bet. And I guess at some stage, if there has been an attack, a successful attack, I guess, is a point where communication with members is needed. And I guess the timeliness of that and the content of that is also incredibly important, not to raise too many concerns amongst the membership, but also to make sure that they're aware if their data has been exfiltrated, what safeguards are going to be provided, all that sort of stuff. There's a massive part of the process.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question in terms of getting the timing right, because quite often, as you just said, in terms of the timing, once an organisation or an individual knows there's been an incident, quite often, it's happened and you're in the stage of dealing with it. So there's always going to be a delay in terms of, you being told. So if your third party supplier, for example, is impacted, then the pension scheme trustees will be told, and obviously there'll be a bit of a delay there. And then the trustees then have an obligation to tell their members. The right time at which to do that can be tricky, because sometimes the trustees will have been told that there's a risk that your data's been impacted, but we can't tell you. So do you tell members then? Because it might be that actually they haven't been affected, and even if you are telling them, you're telling them, we don't really know, there's just a chance. So sort of getting that timing right is really tricky. And I think from the trustees' perspective, it's really important to be asking the right questions of the third party who's had a breach. But inevitably, there's going to only be certain things they can tell their clients, which can prove to be quite frustrating. The regulator made some really interesting comments, actually. They published in February this year an intervention report on the Capita cyber incident. incident. And so I think for anyone who sort of went through that process of dealing with that incident, the information probably isn't particularly new. But for anyone who didn't go through that incident, I think it's a really important lessons learned piece that, people should be reading. There's a bit in there about member communications, and the regulator says that sort of prompt communication should be prioritised so that members are informed and can take steps to protect themselves, which, I think is right. But again, we come back to that question of when do you tell a member? Do you tell them just when definitely there's been an incident, or at what point?
Yeah.
The regulator as well, in terms of this breach of a pension scheme administrator, really encouraged there were template communications that had been produced to go to members, and the regulator encouraged those templates to be used because then communications could go out to members more quickly, which I think in theory makes sense. But I think in practice, our experience was that actually the delay in communicating with members was not often due to trustees wanting their own bespoke templates. It was due to the fact that there was just a really unprecedented demand for such a volume of member communications to be sent out with such urgency that, the sort of administrator couldn't physically send them all at the same time. So in some cases, depending on where you were in the queue, you might have been a trustee board that had agreed to use the template member communications, but were still waiting for weeks to actually get them sent out, which doesn't quite sit with the prioritising communicating with members as quickly as possible. So I suppose that from my perspective, actually a lesson there which could be learned is to think about how you could communicate promptly with members, again, in these sort of calmer times now, which could involve some preparation of thinking, actually, do we have another designated communications provider who, in a world where, our usual supplier who would communicate with members just couldn't, could they then do it? Would they have enough, data to be able to send that out? And if not, think about whether to sort of put one in place. And also thinking about electronic messaging, you could think about as a trustee board going and engaging in a campaign with members to encourage, more email addresses, more electronic communication routes, because that reduces the cost of having to print out materials, but also means that you can communicate a lot more quickly with members and in real time if you need to, as and when developments happen. So there was sort of a bit of an angle there, which where I thought practice and theory didn't quite fit together.
Yeah, tricky. And as you say, it's an evolving subject, and certainly the criminal end of the cyber crime area is an area which is evolving probably faster than any of us are in terms of our protection and support processes. So it does make it even more difficult to make sure that we're doing the right things all the time.
Yeah, and I suppose from your perspective, if you're talking about getting more electronic communication with members, then there's a piece there for trustees to think about how they can make sure that communication with members by email can be as secure as it possibly can, which obviously is a good place where you can come in. Yeah,
indeed, yes. If anyone wants to learn more about electronic comms and how we secure them and encrypt them, then get in contact with us too. But that's been really, really interesting, Sam. Thank you for your insights and information there. It's great. And as Sam said, if you want more detail on how to protect your schemes, then get in contact with her, and I'm sure she'll be pleased to help.
Absolutely.